Picture this. It's the last day of January 1945, deep inside the Reich Chancellery bunker in Berlin, and Adolf Hitler stands there holding a map in his left hand. But the paper won't stop shaking. It's not fear making it tremble, though there's plenty of that in the room. No, this shake is constant now, a rhythmic tremor that's become part of him, making the thin paper flutter like a trapped moth desperately trying to escape. The man is only 55 years old, but he looks 70, maybe older. His face has turned gray, his body bent forward like he's carrying the weight of a collapsing empire on his shoulders. And his eyes have this glassy shine you see in people who haven't slept properly in weeks. People who wake up every 2 hours to nightmares that feel exactly like their waking reality. The map he's holding shows the Oder River, just a thin blue line running north to south through what's left of the Third Reich. And on that map, there are red arrows, bright red arrows pointing west. Those arrows represent Soviet armies, massive and seemingly unstoppable forces that had crossed the Vistula River weeks earlier, torn through Poland and East Prussia like a hot knife through butter, cutting down everything in their path. And now they've reached the Oder at Kustrin, barely 60 kilometers from Berlin. 60 kilometers. That's the distance a healthy man could walk in a single day, the distance the Red Army could cover in just hours once they decided to move. General Theodor Bussy delivers the news in the bunker's conference room, his voice flat and professional, completely drained of everything except the raw facts, because what else can you do when the facts are this terrible? The First Belarusian Front under Marshal Georgy Zhukov has established bridgeheads on the western bank. The First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konyev is doing exactly the same thing to the south. Soviet engineers are already out there in the freezing cold, throwing pontoon bridges across the ice-choked water, working around the clock. The Oder Line, the last major geographical barrier standing between the Red Army and Berlin, has been breached. Hitler stares at that map for what feels like forever. His right hand grips the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turn white, and the tremor in his left hand gets worse, more intense. Then he looks up at Bussy, and the general would later tell Allied interrogators that what he saw in those eyes wasn't exactly fear, and it wasn't even anger in the normal sense, but something much worse, something more disturbing. It was this kind of shocked disbelief, as if reality itself had personally betrayed him, as if the universe had broken some fundamental promise. Impossible, Hitler says, and his voice is hoarse, weakened by years of screaming at subordinates, but it still carries that edge of absolute authority, that tone of a man who believes his words can change facts. The Oder cannot be crossed. I ordered it held. Bussy says nothing because really, what is there to say? The Oder has been crossed. Soviet tanks are already sitting on the western bank. These are facts, hard-cold facts, and facts stopped mattering in this bunker weeks ago. Hitler's gaze moves to Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the Armed Forces High Command, a man whose main qualification for his position seems to be his amazing ability to agree with absolutely everything Hitler says. Keitel stands there ramrod straight in his perfectly pressed uniform, his face carefully blank, revealing nothing. Where is Himmler? Hitler demands. He had given Heinrich Himmler command of Army Group Vistula just weeks before, despite the fact that Himmler has zero military training whatsoever, despite every professional officer in the Wehrmacht knowing it was completely insane. But Himmler commanded the SS, and Hitler trusted the SS above everyone else. That was the logic, if you can even call it logic anymore. The Reichsfuhrer SS is establishing his headquarters, Keitel says carefully, choosing each word like he's walking through a minefield. He is organizing the defenses. Organizing. Hitler repeats the word like it tastes foul in his mouth. The Soviets are across the Oder, and he is organizing. His voice starts rising, that familiar rage building. I gave him an army. I gave him divisions. Where are they? Where are the counterattacks I ordered? The question just hangs there in the stale bunker air. Outside in the real world, the answer is brutally simple. The divisions Hitler is talking about exist primarily on paper, nothing more than names and numbers in a filing system. Army Group Vistula is actually just a collection of shattered units, undertrained Volkssturm militia made up of teenagers and old men with rifles and barely any ammunition, tank battalions that have no tanks, artillery batteries with no shells to fire. The Wehrmacht that conquered most of Europe is gone, bled dry in the frozen hell of Russia, ground down to nothing in the beaches of Normandy, encircled and destroyed in the Ardennes. What remains is essentially a ghost army commanded by a man who has never commanded anything larger than a desk job. But here in the bunker, truth has become something you can negotiate with, something flexible. So Keitel says exactly what's expected. The counterattacks are being prepared, my Führer. The situation is being stabilized. Hitler turns back to the map, and his shaking finger traces those red arrows pushing west from the Oder, following their path toward Berlin. They must be thrown back, he says with absolute conviction. Every meter of ground must be held. Every bridge must be destroyed. The Oder line is the shield of Berlin. It cannot fall, but it has already fallen. Everyone standing in that room knows it. The Soviets have amassed 2.2 million men along the Oder. Thousands upon thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, all aimed at the heart of Germany. Against them, the Germans can maybe scrape together 400,000 troops, most of them exhausted beyond belief, poorly equipped, and increasingly convinced that this war is already lost. The mathematics aren't complicated. A child could do this math. But Hitler isn't doing mathematics anymore. He's doing something else entirely, something that has kept him going through 5.5 years of total war and is now somehow sustaining him through its complete collapse. He is trying to will reality itself to conform to his orders, to bend the universe to match his vision. He has always believed with the absolute fervor of a religious prophet that willpower alone could overcome material facts, that determination could defeat physics itself. And it had worked in 1940 when his generals told him France couldn't possibly be beaten in 6 weeks, and he proved them spectacularly wrong. It had worked 100 times since, until suddenly it stopped working, until the laws of physics and logistics and simple human endurance finally reasserted themselves and said no more. But he cannot accept that it has stopped working, because to accept that would be to accept that everything, all of it, every single sacrifice and battle and death, had been for absolutely nothing. I want Steiner's attack launched immediately, Hitler says with finality. SS Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner commands what Hitler insists on calling an army group, but what actually consists of just a few scattered divisions, barely enough to hold a defensive line, let alone launch an offensive. He will strike north from the Oder, cut off Zhukov's spearheads, and restore the line. Steiner's forces are nowhere near strong enough to cut off anything. They barely have enough fuel to move their vehicles 10 kilometers. But Hitler has decided it will happen, so in his mind it will happen, it must happen. Yes, my Führer, Keitel says, because what else can he say? The conference continues for another hour of this surreal theater. Hitler issues orders for units that no longer exist to attack positions that fell days ago. He demands that rivers be held that the enemy crossed last week. He speaks with passionate conviction about wonder weapons that will somehow turn the tide, about jet aircraft that will sweep the skies clear of Allied bombers, about new tank divisions being formed in the West that will march east and smash the Soviet armies against the Oder like waves against a rock. None of it is real. Not a single word. But all of it is necessary because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. Because the alternative is to look at that map and actually see what's really there. A noose tightening steadily around Berlin, and at the center of that noose, this bunker, and in this bunker him. When the conference finally ends and the generals file out like students leaving a particularly disturbing lecture, Hitler remains at the table, just staring at the map. His secretaries, watching nervously from the doorway, see him lean forward until his face is almost touching the paper, as if he could somehow change what it shows through sheer proximity, through pure force of will. Traudl Junge, his youngest secretary, would later write that she had never seen him look so old, so diminished, so utterly and completely alone. But then something changes. He straightens up, and when he turns to face them, his expression has shifted. The rage has drained away. In its place is something much harder to read, something almost serene, almost peaceful. They think they have won, he says, speaking to no one in particular, maybe to everyone, maybe to history itself. They think because they have reached the Oder, they have reached Berlin. They do not understand. Berlin is not just a city. It is an idea, and ideas cannot be conquered by tanks. It's the kind of mystical rhetoric he's been using for months now, ever since strategic thinking became too painful, too connected to reality. His secretaries nod politely because that's what you do in this bunker. You nod. You agree. You pretend that the words carry meaning. The next day, February 1st, Soviet forces expand their bridgeheads across the Oder like a patient predator slowly tightening its grip. Zhukov's engineers work around the clock, 24 hours a day, building bridges strong enough to support the massive T-34 tanks that will lead the final assault on Berlin. The ice on the river is breaking up with the changing weather, making the crossings more difficult and dangerous. But the Soviets learned their trade in the hardest school imaginable, for years of brutal warfare from Stalingrad to Warsaw. They know exactly how to build bridges under constant enemy fire, how to move entire armies across rivers, how to keep supplies flowing forward even as the Germans throw literally everything they have left at the crossing points. And the Germans do throw everything. Luftwaffe pilots flying obsolete aircraft, held together with prayer and running on fumes, dive at those bridges and get swatted from the sky by concentrated Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Artillery batteries firing their very last shells try desperately to collapse the pontoons and succeed only in churning up the water. Volkssturm units, old men in their 60s and boys barely 14 years old carrying Panzerfausts, creep toward the bridgeheads at night and get cut down by Soviet machine guns before they get within 100 meters. The Oder line is not abandoned without a fight. It's simply that the fight is completely hopeless, and everyone except the man in the bunker knows it. Back in the bunker, Hitler's rage grows like a living thing, feeding on itself. When reports come in of Soviet advances, he immediately blames his generals. When those generals report that units cannot attack because they lack ammunition, he blames them for poor planning and incompetence. When they carefully explain that units cannot attack because the units literally do not exist anymore, he accuses them of defeatism, of cowardice, of treason. The word treason comes up more and more often now. It's become his explanation for everything, his way of making sense of the incomprehensible. The war isn't being lost because the enemy is stronger, more numerous, better supplied. No, it's being lost because his subordinates keep betraying him, keep failing to execute his brilliant plans. He summons Himmler to the bunker and demands to know why Army Group Vistula failed to hold the Oder. Himmler, who has spent the past weeks in a state of barely controlled panic, desperately fumbles through some explanation about Soviet superiority in numbers and the incredible difficulty of coordinating scattered units without proper communications. Hitler cuts him off mid-sentence. "Excuses," he says coldly. "I gave you an army. You lost it. That is treason." Himmler goes visibly pale because the word treason coming from Hitler's mouth is effectively a death sentence. But Hitler doesn't pursue it further. He needs Himmler, needs the SS, needs the desperate illusion that someone somewhere is still loyal to the vision. So he lets it drop, and Himmler flees the bunker as quickly as dignity allows. And Hitler turns back to his maps, his constant companions now. The maps are covered with symbols by this point, neat little rectangles and triangles representing divisions and corps that exist only in Hitler's increasingly detached mind. Staff officers update them daily with straight faces, adding new units that aren't real, moving old ones that have ceased to exist, creating on paper the army that reality has stripped away. It's become a kind of collaborative fiction, a shared delusion, and everyone participates because the alternative is to tell Hitler the brutal truth, and the truth would either kill him or get them killed. It's genuinely hard to say which. Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, and one of the very few men who still dares to speak honestly to Hitler, visits the bunker in early February. He finds Hitler hunched over those maps like always, moving pins with his trembling hand, muttering to himself about counterattacks and encirclements that will never happen. Speer watches this disturbing scene for a moment, then clears his throat carefully. "My Führer, we need to discuss the evacuation of Berlin's civilians." Hitler looks up slowly, his eyes taking a moment to focus on Speer like he's emerging from deep water. Evacuation? The Soviets are 60 kilometers away. When they attack, and they will attack, the city will become a battlefield. The civilians should be moved west to safety while there's still time. Hitler's face darkens instantly like a storm cloud moving across the sun. "There will be no evacuation," he says flatly. "Berlin will be defended. Every man, woman, and child will fight." "My Führer, most of them are not soldiers," Speer says carefully. "They are families, children, elderly people. Then they will learn to be soldiers," Hitler snaps, his voice rising again to that familiar pitch of rage. "Do you think I care about their comfort? Do you think I care if they suffer? Germany has proven itself weak. Germany has failed me. If the people cannot defend their capital, then they deserve to perish with it." Speer just stares at him, genuinely shocked. This is something new, this open contempt for the German people themselves. Hitler has always presented himself as Germany's savior, the champion of the Volk, the defender of the German people. But now, faced with inevitable defeat, the mask is slipping away and revealing something ugly underneath. The people have failed to live up to his impossible vision, and so they have become expendable, just another resource to be used up. Speer leaves the bunker that day knowing with absolute certainty that he will not return. Later he will write that the man he saw in February 1945 was not the man he had known for years. That man is gone, completely gone, replaced by something hollow and venomous, just a shell animated only by rage and spite, and the desperate need to make someone pay for his failure. But Hitler is not entirely divorced from reality. In his clearer moments, in those brief windows when the fog lifts, he understands what's coming. He knows the Red Army will not stop at the Oder. He knows Berlin will be surrounded, attacked, probably taken. What he absolutely cannot accept, what he refuses to even consider, is what will happen to him personally when that moment arrives. He speaks constantly in those final weeks about fighting to the very last, about dying in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, about never surrendering under any circumstances. It's the one thing he remains absolutely consistent about. He will not be captured. He will not be paraded through the streets of Moscow in chains like some conquered barbarian king. He will not face trial at the hands of his enemies. He will die first, and he will take as many others with him as he possibly can. The orders he issues during this period reflect this apocalyptic mindset. On February 3rd, he commands that all bridges in Berlin be prepared for demolition. If the Soviets enter the city, they will find nothing but rubble and ash. He orders factories destroyed, power plants demolished, food stores burned to the ground. Germany, if it cannot remain his, will be no one's. It will be scorched earth on a scale never before seen. Speer, absolutely appalled by these orders, quietly countermands many of them when Hitler isn't looking, saving what infrastructure he can for whoever survives this nightmare. But Hitler's intent is crystal clear. This will not be a strategic retreat or an organized withdrawal. This will be an apocalypse, a Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods. In the bunker's conference room, the daily briefings become increasingly surreal, like something from a fever dream. Officers report on battles that were already lost days ago, on units that have long since ceased to exist, on plans that cannot possibly be executed with the resources available. Hitler listens with that glassy stare, nods mechanically, issues new orders that directly contradict the old ones, then forgets what he just said and issues contradictory orders again an hour later. His staff learns to smile, to agree enthusiastically, to write everything down, and then quietly do whatever seems least insane once they leave the room. Gerhard Bolt, a young officer assigned to brief Hitler on the Eastern Front situation, would later describe the experience as being like trying to speak to someone who is drowning underwater. Hitler would stare at him with those unfocused eyes, his face slack and expressionless, and Bolt would genuinely wonder if the Führer was even hearing the words coming out of his mouth. Then suddenly Hitler would explode into incandescent rage over some tiny detail, some unit that retreated without permission, some general who dared question an order. The rage would burn white-hot for a few minutes, and then burn itself out just as quickly, leaving Hitler completely exhausted, slumped in his chair, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold a pen. He was a ruin, Bolt wrote years after the war. Not just physically, though that was terrible enough. His whole being was a ruin. He could not think clearly anymore, could not plan beyond the next hour, could not accept any version of reality that didn't match his delusions. He lived in a world entirely of his own creation, and in that world, Germany was still winning the war. But even in that delusional world, the Oder crossing remains a persistent problem that won't go away. Hitler returns to it obsessively, like picking at a wound, demanding constant updates, ordering counterattacks that will never materialize, insisting with religious fervor that Zhukov's bridgeheads must be eliminated. When reports inevitably come in that the counterattacks have failed, he blames the commanders. When new commanders are appointed and their attacks fail too because physics and reality still apply, he blames them as well. The pattern repeats endlessly until there are simply no more commanders left to blame, no more units to throw away, no more tricks to pull. By mid-February, the Soviets have completely consolidated their positions along the Oder. Zhukov's forces hold a solid continuous front stretching all the way south to the Neisse River. They are not advancing yet, not pushing toward Berlin. Stalin has personally ordered them to wait, to methodically build up supplies, to prepare with Soviet thoroughness for the final assault on the Nazi capital. But they are sitting there, just 60 kilometers away, and everyone in Berlin can feel their presence like a gathering storm on the horizon. The city's population, already battered and traumatized by years of relentless Allied bombing, begins to panic. Those with money or connections flee west toward the American and British lines. Those without either option hunker down in their cellars and wait for the end. In the bunker, Hitler's world contracts even further, shrinking down to just a few rooms of concrete and steel. He stops going outside entirely, even to the Chancellery garden above. He stops meeting with anyone except his immediate staff, the handful of people who still play along with the charade. His days blur together into one endless, nightmarish cycle of conferences, explosive rages, and brief periods of fitful sleep that bring no rest. His health deteriorates in ways that are visible to everyone. The tremor in his left hand spreads slowly to his left leg. He walks with an old man's shuffle now, his back permanently bent, his gaze fixed on the floor in front of him. His secretaries whisper among themselves that he looks like a ghost haunting his own life, already dead but not yet buried. But somehow he still gives orders with that same absolute authority. On February 16th, he declares that any soldier who retreats without explicit orders will be immediately executed, no trial necessary. On February 20th, he orders the formation of entirely new divisions to defend Berlin, divisions that will supposedly be scraped together from training schools, administrative units, and basically anyone who can hold a rifle and point it in the right direction. On February 25th, he announces with great drama that Berlin will never surrender, that it will be defended street by street, house by house, room by room until the last German is dead. The orders continue to flow out with that same tone of absolute authority Hitler has always commanded. But now, increasingly, they are simply ignored by the people who are supposed to execute them. Generals nod respectfully, agree verbally, and then walk out and do whatever they think might actually save some lives. Units retreat when tactical reality demands it, regardless of what the orders say. Civilians flee the city when they get the chance, regardless of the prohibitions. The vast machinery of the Third Reich is breaking down piece by piece, and Hitler's iron will, which once held it all together through sheer force of personality, is simply no longer enough. On the Oder, the Soviets wait with the patience of experienced hunters. They are in no particular hurry now. They have learned through 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history that patience saves lives, that rushing gets soldiers killed unnecessarily. They will attack when they are completely ready, when their supply lines are rock solid, when their plans are as perfect as plans can be in war. And when they finally attack, when they finally decide the moment has come, they will not stop moving forward until they reach the Reich Chancellery itself. Hitler knows this in his clearer moments. He knows it with perfect clarity that cuts through all the delusion. The war is lost beyond any doubt. Germany is finished as a military power. All that remains now is choosing the manner of the ending, and he has already decided on his ending. He will stay in Berlin no matter what. He will fight to the absolute last moment. And when that final moment comes, when there is nowhere left to run, he will take his own life rather than face capture by his enemies. He speaks of this openly now to his secretaries, to his adjutants, to basically anyone who will listen and even those who won't. I will never leave Berlin, he says repeatedly like a mantra. I will die here. That is my destiny. His staff, listening to these pronouncements, feel a genuine chill run down their spines. He is not speaking metaphorically or dramatically. He means it literally, completely literally. He has already begun actively planning his suicide, discussing methods in disturbing detail, making careful arrangements for afterward. The bunker, which was originally built as a command center for prosecuting the war, is slowly transforming into a tomb. But even as he meticulously plans his own death, he cannot stop giving orders, cannot stop pretending that somehow the war can still be won if everyone just follows his vision. It's as if two completely different Hitlers exist simultaneously in the same body. The one who knows the truth and is calmly preparing to die, and the one who still believes desperately in miracles and keeps issuing impossible commands based on fantasy. These two versions coexist uneasily, sometimes showing up in the same conversation, sometimes even in the same sentence, creating a schizophrenic effect that disturbs everyone who witnesses it. The Oder line must be restored, he tells his generals on March 1st with absolute conviction. Steiner's attack will cut off the Soviet bridgeheads. The enemy will be thrown back across the river. Then, literally in the same breath, almost as a casual afterthought, he adds, and if we fail, if Berlin falls, then Germany deserves to perish. We will burn it all to the ground. The generals exchange quick glances, but say nothing. What is there to say to that? They salute mechanically, leave the bunker, and go back to the impossible task of trying to manage a complete catastrophe with no tools, no resources, and no time. March arrives, and still the Soviets wait patiently on the Oder, building their strength, preparing methodically for the final blow. In the bunker, Hitler's rages become even more frequent, more intense, more completely detached from any version of reality. He screams at maps as if they are personally responsible for his defeat. He screams at officers who are just trying to do their jobs. He screams at the concrete walls themselves. He weeps, though his staff carefully pretends not to notice because acknowledging it would make everything too real. He issues orders and then forgets them within hours, then issues completely contradictory orders and forgets those too. The tremor in his hand becomes a constant violent shaking that makes it physically impossible for him to write legibly anymore. His secretaries have to transcribe his words for him, words that come out in disjointed fragments, half-finished thoughts that just trail off into heavy silence. And through it all, echoing constantly through the bunker's cold concrete corridors, is that original question, the question that started this entire nightmare, the question that brought his carefully constructed world crashing down around him. The Red Army has crossed the Oder. What do we do now? Hitler's answer, delivered in explosive rage and desperate denial and utterly impossible orders, is always the same. We fight. We hold every meter of ground. We never surrender under any circumstances. Reality, in the form of 2.2 million Soviet soldiers armed with thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of artillery pieces, has a very different answer prepared. But that answer will take another 2 brutal months to fully deliver. 2 months of continuous fighting and dying and burning. 2 months of horror that will ultimately end in this same bunker in Berlin with a gunshot and a body burning in a shell crater in the Chancellery Garden. But on that particular day in late January, when the news first arrived that the Oder had been crossed, that the last barrier had fallen, Hitler's response was simpler, more direct, more revealing of the man he had fundamentally become. He looked at that map with its red arrows pointing inexorably toward his capital, toward everything he had built, and he said the only thing he could possibly say, the only words he had left: impossible. I ordered it held. And in that single moment, in that one simple word spoken with such absolute conviction, the entire edifice of Nazi Germany was laid completely bare for what it really was. Not a nation built on any coherent principle. Not an ideology that could survive contact with reality. Not a movement that could adapt to changing circumstances. Just one man's will, imposed through terror and belief. And when that will finally broke against the immovable reality of physics and mathematics and human endurance, there was nothing left underneath but ash and death, and the echo of orders that could no longer be obeyed.